A single nation with one language, one culture, and a shared past stretching back thousands of years suddenly splits into two entirely different realities. For most of its history, Korea existed as a unified civilization, shaped by dynasties, traditions, and a strong sense of identity. That long continuity was broken in 1910 when Japan formally annexed the Korean peninsula. What followed was not just foreign rule. It was an attempt to reshape an entire society. Korean language and identity were pushed aside. Names were changed to sound Japanese. Cultural practices were discouraged or outright banned. Millions were forced into labor, while others were sent to fight in wars that had nothing to do with their homeland. By the time the Second World War was nearing its end, Korea was exhausted, stripped of resources, and desperate for independence. In 1945, Japan surrendered. For Koreans, it should have been the moment of liberation, a chance to rebuild their country as one. Instead, something unexpected happened. The peninsula became caught between two rising global powers. The Soviet Union moved into the north, while the United States took control of the south. In what was meant to be a temporary measure, the country was divided along the 38th parallel. At the time, it seemed like a quick administrative decision. Few imagined that this line would turn into one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world. In the north, a new system began to form under Kim Il-sung, supported by the Soviet Union. In the south, a different political path emerged under American influence. By 1948, two separate governments had been established, each claiming to represent the entire Korean people. Tension between the two sides grew quickly. Both governments believed reunification was inevitable, but each wanted it on their own terms. That tension exploded on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces launched a sudden invasion across the border. The early days of the war moved fast. Northern forces advanced rapidly, capturing major cities and pushing southern troops into retreat. It seemed for a moment that the entire peninsula might fall under northern control. But the conflict did not remain local for long. The United States and United Nations forces intervened to support the South. Soon after, China entered the war on the side of the North. What began as a civil war turned into a major international conflict. The Korean War became one of the most intense and destructive confrontations of the Cold War era. Cities were flattened, infrastructure was wiped out, families were separated, often permanently. Millions of people lost their lives, both soldiers and civilians. For North Korea, the destruction was overwhelming. Large parts of the country were reduced to rubble. Bombing campaigns left entire urban areas in ruins. At one point, nearly every major building had been destroyed. Rebuilding a nation after that level of devastation was not just difficult. It shaped how the country would see the world for generations. In 1953, the fighting came to a halt with an armistice agreement, but there was no peace treaty. That detail still matters. Technically, the war never ended. North Korea and South Korea remain in a state of conflict to this day. The border between them, known as the demilitarized zone, is heavily fortified, lined with fences, soldiers, and hidden landmines. It is less a border and more a lasting reminder of a war that never fully closed. The impact of the war went far beyond physical destruction. It created a deep sense of insecurity in North Korea. The memory of invasion, bombing, and near collapse shaped how the leadership viewed the outside world. Instead of seeing other nations as partners, they were often seen as threats. Under Kim Il-sung, the country began to rebuild. But the rebuilding process was not only about infrastructure. It was about shaping society itself. Power became highly centralized, control over information tightened, outside influence was restricted. The government introduced an ideology known as juche, often translated as self-reliance. At first glance, the idea seemed straightforward. A nation should depend on itself rather than outside powers. But in practice, it went much further. Politically, it meant rejecting foreign influence. Economically, it meant trying to produce everything within the country. Militarily, it meant preparing to stand alone against any threat. Over time, this approach began to close the country off. Trade with other nations was limited, foreign media was blocked, travel was restricted. The outside world became more distant, not because it disappeared, but because access to it was tightly controlled. At the same time, the government built a powerful internal narrative. The leadership was presented not just as political authority, but as central to the nation's identity. Education, media, and public life were shaped to reinforce a single unified message. Citizens had little exposure to alternative perspectives. During the 1960s, North Korea was not yet fully isolated. In fact, it showed signs of stability and growth. With support from larger allies, its economy developed through heavy industry and centralized planning. For a time, living conditions in the north were comparable to those in the south, and in some areas even better. But beneath that surface, the foundations of isolation were already taking shape. The country relied heavily on support from larger powers, especially the Soviet Union and China. At the same time, it remained cautious about becoming too dependent on either one. This careful balancing act reflected a deeper concern about relying on outsiders. Inside the country, control continued to grow. Information from abroad was limited. Cultural influence from other nations was reduced. Over time, the outside world became less familiar to ordinary citizens. Even though trade and diplomatic relations still existed, the direction was clear. North Korea was slowly turning inward. This gradual shift did not happen overnight. It was built layer by layer, shaped by war, ideology, and a growing sense of vulnerability. By the time the Cold War entered its later years, the path ahead was already forming. What had begun as a response to external pressure was becoming a defining feature of the country itself. And then a major global change would push the process much further, turning a controlled system into one facing sudden isolation on a scale no one had fully anticipated. The moment that dramatically altered North Korea's trajectory came in 1991, when the Soviet Union, its largest ally and lifeline, collapsed. For decades, North Korea had relied on Moscow for subsidized fuel, machinery, technology, and financial support. That network vanished almost overnight, leaving the country to operate without the external assistance it had quietly depended upon. The impact was immediate and severe. Factories that relied on imported energy slowed or stopped production. Transportation systems dependent on fuel and spare parts struggled to function. Agricultural output declined as fertilizers and machinery became scarce. The economy, already rigid and centralized, could not adapt quickly. Trade dropped sharply. Exports that once sustained industrial and civilian life dwindled. Exports were limited, and access to foreign currency became scarce. The country faced a sudden, forced self-reliance, exactly the principle of Juche, but under extreme duress. Other nations in similar situations took a different path. China had already begun experimenting with economic reform, opening markets to foreign investment, allowing private enterprise and modernizing infrastructure. Those changes brought growth, technology, and improved living standards. North Korea, however, remained cautious. Economic reform was seen as a threat to political control, and exposure to foreign ideas could challenge authority. The leadership doubled down on isolation rather than loosening it. The choice had profound consequences. By the mid-1990s, North Korea entered a period of widespread crisis known as the Arduous March. Economic collapse, compounded by natural disasters such as floods and droughts, devastated the agricultural sector. Crops failed, food distribution systems broke down, and millions of citizens faced hunger. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands and possibly over 1 million perished in one of the most severe peacetime famines in modern history. Despite the crisis, the state maintained strict control. International aid was allowed, but tightly monitored, ensuring that the leadership preserved authority above all else. At the same time, necessity forced small adaptations at the grassroots level. Informal markets emerged as citizens traded goods privately, creating a limited underground economy. These markets became essential for survival, representing a quiet contradiction. The state enforced isolation and control, while ordinary people navigated shortages through ingenuity. The 1990s transformed North Korea fundamentally. The economy weakened, the population endured immense hardship, and connection to the wider world diminished. Isolation was no longer a trend or ideology. It had become a concrete reality. By the time the world entered the 21st century, the framework for extreme separation from the global system was firmly in place. Leadership transitions reinforced this trajectory. Kim Il-sung's death in 1994 brought his son Kim Jong-il to power. The succession maintained the focus on a highly centralized, personality-driven state. Facing the aftermath of famine, economic collapse, and the sudden loss of Soviet support, the new leadership made a defining choice: military strength above all else. This Songun, or military-first policy, prioritized armed forces over civilian needs. Resources flowed to the military even as ordinary citizens continued to struggle. Survival was now framed as defense against constant external threat, reinforcing the logic of isolation. Military strength alone was not enough to secure the regime. Nuclear weapons became the ultimate tool for deterrence and security. Although the foundations for a nuclear program had existed for decades, by the early 2000s, it became a central focus. The regime viewed nuclear capability as the ultimate guarantee against foreign intervention, a way to ensure survival regardless of international pressure. In 2006, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. The event signaled a new era. The global response was immediate. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and limits on financial transactions followed. International isolation was intensified, cutting off more avenues for trade and cooperation. The country's connections to the outside world shrank further. Despite this, the nuclear program continued, followed by more tests and missile launches, each bringing additional rounds of sanctions. This combination of internal policy and external pressure cemented North Korea's isolation. Domestically, information, movement, and contact with foreigners remained tightly controlled. Foreign media, books, and broadcasts were largely banned. Travel outside the country was almost impossible without state approval. Citizens experienced the wider world only through state-sanctioned narratives, shaping perception and understanding. Externally, sanctions and political tension limited engagement. Even countries with diplomatic relations had to navigate strict regulations. Trade existed, but it was constrained and monitored closely. China remained the critical lifeline, providing essential economic support and serving as the primary link to the global system. Russia maintained smaller ties, but neither relationship reversed the larger pattern of isolation. By 2011, another leadership change occurred. Kim Jong-il's death brought Kim Jong-un to power. Initially, there was speculation about potential reforms. Could the young leader open the economy or loosen social controls? The answer was no. While small adjustments appeared, such as limited tolerance of informal markets, the core system of control remained intact. Political authority, ideological messaging, and isolation persisted. The nuclear program accelerated. Missile tests increased in frequency and sophistication, and sanctions grew even stricter. Through these decades, North Korea's isolation was shaped by both choice and circumstance. History, ideology, and global shifts created a situation where self-reliance became necessary. Military power became survival, and strict control became routine. Isolation was reinforced internally through policy and externally through sanctions and global caution. By the early 21st century, North Korea existed as a state, largely separate from the world. A combination of inherited circumstances, deliberate decisions, and global reaction. And yet, even in this rigid system, quiet adaptations persisted. Markets and informal trade continued, citizens found ways to survive, and the country retained minimal engagement through China. These small openings, however limited, were exceptions rather than a change in direction. Isolation had become a defining feature, shaping society, politics, and daily life in ways few nations in modern history have experienced. The history of North Korea's isolation demonstrates how deeply interconnected events can create a self-reinforcing system. War, occupation, ideology, famine, and nuclear ambitions combined with global reactions to create a country increasingly separate from the international order. By the time the next chapter began, the foundations for a uniquely isolated state were firmly established. By the time Kim Jong-un assumed power in 2011, North Korea's isolation was no longer forming. It was solidified. The country had survived war, famine, and economic collapse. But it had done so by doubling down on control rather than opening its doors. Kim Jong-un inherited a state built on self-reliance, fear of external threats, and centralized authority. His rise represented continuity rather than reform, and the structures of isolation were already embedded deeply into society, politics, and the economy. The nuclear program, already central under Kim Jong-il, became even more prominent. Kim Jong-un accelerated missile tests, developed increasingly sophisticated weapons, and publicly showcased his regime's growing technical capabilities. For the leadership, nuclear weapons were both a deterrent and a statement. North Korea would defend itself at any cost, even if the rest of the world imposed sanctions and isolation. Each test drew international condemnation, led to tighter economic sanctions, and increased the country's estrangement from global systems. Yet from Pyongyang's perspective, these measures reinforced security, authority, and survival. Isolation, in this sense, was both shield and strategy. While the regime pursued nuclear advancement, life inside North Korea reflected a complicated balance between strict control and practical adaptation. The informal markets, which had emerged during the famine, became slightly more tolerated. People relied on these markets for food, household goods, and basic commerce. Small pockets of economic activity developed quietly within the rigid structure, creating a paradox. The state controlled nearly all formal systems, yet citizens carved out informal networks essential for survival. These adjustments did not diminish the country's isolation. Instead, they allowed the population to function within it, sustaining daily life without challenging the broader political framework. Culturally and socially, the government maintained strict control over information and education. Foreign media, books, films, and even casual communication with outsiders remained largely prohibited. The leadership cultivated a narrative centered around loyalty, national pride, and the centrality of the ruling family. Citizens' understanding of the outside world was filtered through carefully controlled messaging, reinforcing a sense of distance and difference. Exposure to external ideas was minimal, further embedding the psychological aspect of isolation. Externally, the international community continued to respond with caution and restriction. United Nations sanctions aimed at curbing nuclear development, limited trade, financial transactions, and access to technology. Countries that maintained relations with North Korea operated under tight regulations, reinforcing the country's limited global engagement. China remained the most significant partner, providing economic support, essential goods, and acting as a conduit for limited international interaction. Russia played a smaller role, but these alliances did little to reverse the broader pattern of self-separation.